Aloha, and welcome back to Leaving the Church to Find God, your safe space for exploring faith beyond traditional walls. I'm your host, Melissa, and whether you grew up in the evangelical church like I did, or any other system while seeking answers, you're in the right place. This podcast isn't about judgment or attacking institutions. It's about honest conversations, diverse spiritual paths, and celebrating the unique journeys that we all take in search of meaning. We've all experienced indoctrination in some form, and here we explore how it shapes our understanding of ourselves and the divine. Each week, we'll dive into thought-provoking topics, share inspiring stories from guests and listeners like you, and offer tools and insights for navigating your own deconstruction journey. Remember, leaving the church doesn't mean leaving your faith. It's about finding your own authentic connection to something greater. So buckle up, embrace the open dialogue, and join me as we explore what it means to move beyond confines and discover the deeper personal connection to the divine that exists within us all. Aloha God Pod. Today we have a very special guest, Lynn Smith Gregory. She grew up in Utah as one of 9 children in a devout Mormon family. Her great-great-uncle was Joseph Smith, founder of the Mormon Church. At 19, she left the church and moved to New York City, eventually obtaining an MBA at NYU. After a 20-year career in the tech industry, she left to pursue writing full-time and has attended the Iowa Summer Writing Program and the Breadloaf Writers Conference. She lives in Savannah, Georgia with her husband. Aloha, Lynn. Welcome to the Leaving the Church to Find God podcast. I appreciate you being here. We always start these conversations. Thank you. We always start these conversations with, where did it first crack for you? What brought you to leave the church?
It was actually a challenge by a professor of mine when I went away to college. My background is Mormon, and I went, instead of going to BYU, I had graduated a year early from high school. So I said, well, I'll do a year at this state school before I transfer to BYU, which is like Harvard for Mormons. That's the school everybody wants to go to if you're a Mormon. And I had an atheist professor for my creative writing class. And I had written a short story about my parents arguing about going to church, and he really liked it. And he asked me to read it out loud in class. And then afterwards, he said, "So you're a believer?" And I said, "Oh, yeah." And he said, And that was the first time anybody, because I grew up in Utah where the majority of people are Mormon, I realized that was a negative to him. And I was sort of taken back, and he said, "Well, I challenge you to come to the Bible is Literature class next semester." And I realized at that point that I was going to have to defend my faith, and I felt totally up for the challenge. And so instead of going home over the break before the next semester started, I asked to borrow books that were not in the Utah libraries about the Mormon Church and Joseph Smith in particular. Now, my maiden name is Smith, so I have to add here that Joseph Smith is my great-great-uncle. My great-great-grandfather, Samuel Smith, was Joseph Smith's younger brother and the first convert to the Mormon Church. And there have been 4 generations of unbroken devotion. Wow. And so I started reading these scholarly works on the Mormon Church, specifically Fawn Brody's book, No Man Knows My History, which is still considered one of the definitive books on the history of Joseph Smith. And as I turned the pages, I was in shock. And I discovered for the first time context for religion. I realized the atmosphere that Joseph Smith grew up in, some of his background activities before he became a prophet, And I saw the evolution of this young man into becoming a religious figure. And rather than a 14-year-old boy who had been approached by Jesus and God and said, you need to start your own church, because none of them are true. And all of a sudden, things start falling into place. Questions I'd had younger, like, well, he found these plates of gold, which turned out to be the Book of Mormon, right in his backyard. That's really convenient, that's where an ancient civilization ended up burying this record. And it's supposedly the record of the Native Americans who lived on the continent. But then I was reading about how he used to make up stories about Native Americans, ancient civilizations that devolved into Native Americans as we currently experience them when Columbus came. And I suddenly saw things differently. And I spent the week just trapped in the library, buried in these texts. And I suddenly realized there was a tipping point where I read that he had copied the temple ceremonies that were so sacred and supposedly based on the ceremonies in King Solomon's temple from the Masons, because he was a Freemason. And I just didn't believe it anymore. And what it was not like, well, I guess I don't believe it. It was like I realized I no longer believed it. And it came as a shock to me because it wasn't a conscious decision that I'd made. It was a realization of recognizing the facts. And the facts had told me a different story. And the reason those books were forbidden to read became obvious to me. And this was before the internet. So you could avoid damaging information about the Mormon Church much more easily than you can today. And in typical 19-year-old behavior, I decided, well, if Joseph Smith was a fraud, maybe this whole idea of God is a fraud too, and became an atheist. Just like that.
Mm.
I threw the baby out with the bathwater, and I didn't realize what I was closing the door on. And it created a kind of existential angst, really. What is the meaning of our lives on Earth if it's just a random universe, an accident, a petri dish that suddenly had the right combination of ingredients to create the world? So it took me a while before I changed my perspective, and it was through a spiritual experience that I realized I wasn't an atheist anymore.
Do you mind telling me about that experience?
Sure, even though I'll tell you a little bit about it. I covered my story more extensively in my memoir, which is currently being shopped to publishers as we speak. It's called We Were Smiths, Escaping the Shadow of Joseph Smith's Mormon Legacy. And it's a story of leaving the church. My sister and I both left about the same time for very different reasons. and our trajectories ended up very, very differently because of choices that we made. Younger, like, well, he found these plates of gold, which turned out to be the Book of Mormon, right in his backyard. That's really convenient, that's where an ancient civilization ended up burying this record. And it's supposedly the record of the Native Americans who lived on the continent. But then I was reading about how he used to make up stories about Native Americans, ancient civilizations that devolved into Native Americans as we currently experience them when Columbus came. And I suddenly saw things differently. And I spent the week just trapped in the library, buried in these texts. And I suddenly realized there was a tipping point where I read that he had copied the temple ceremonies that were so sacred and supposedly based on the ceremonies in King Solomon's temple from the Masons, because he was a Freemason. And I just didn't believe it anymore. And what it was not like, well, I guess I don't believe it. It was like I realized I no longer believed it. And it came as a shock to me because it wasn't a conscious decision that I'd made. It was a realization of recognizing the facts. And the facts had told me a different story. And the reason those books were forbidden to read became obvious to me. And this was before the internet. So you could avoid damaging information about the Mormon Church much more easily than you can today. And in typical 19-year-old behavior, I decided, well, if Joseph Smith was a fraud, maybe this whole idea of God is a fraud too, and became an atheist. Just like that.
Mm.
I threw the baby out with the bathwater, and I didn't realize what I was closing the door on. And it created a kind of existential angst, really. What is the meaning of our lives on Earth if it's just a random universe, an accident, a petri dish that suddenly had the right combination of ingredients to create the world? So it took me a while before I changed my perspective, and it was through a spiritual experience that I realized I wasn't an atheist anymore.
Do you mind telling me about that experience?
Sure, even though I'll tell you a little bit about it. I covered my story more extensively in my memoir, which is currently being shopped to publishers as we speak. It's called We Were Smiths, Escaping the Shadow of Joseph Smith's Mormon Legacy. And it's a story of leaving the church. My sister and I both left about the same time for very different reasons. And our trajectories ended up very, very differently because of choices that we made. I was struggling with the meaninglessness of life. And I was not able to outrun my past, the indoctrination. I tried very hard. I went to therapy. I read things. Science became my new God. but it was somehow ultimately unsatisfying. And it didn't answer questions about, well, where does love come from?
Mhm.
It shut the door on mystery, awe, wonder. Where does altruism come from? I wasn't happy. And after a crisis between my husband and I remember wishing that I believed in something because I didn't know where to go for answers. And I remember thinking, I wish I could pray. And I realized I was in the posture of prayer, that in my unhappiness, I had sunk to the floor and was on my knees. And I didn't think too much about it. But at the time, just recognized, wow, full circle here. And then I had an experience of a presence. Um, it's very hard to describe. And I was an atheist, so it was the last thing I was expecting was this feeling, sudden being flooded with this feeling of love, acceptance, and awareness that there was something beyond myself. And I remember saying out loud, is this God? Are you God? And I didn't really get an answer to that question. I just knew that if I made certain changes in my life, that I was going to be okay. And that was to open up to the idea of something bigger than myself. And I was terrified that meant, what, I'm going to have to return to the Mormon Church? It's so funny, the black and white thinking.
Yes, for sure.
If your only context of God is this, then it's hard to open your mind to the idea of what else it can be.
Mhm.
But that's the point at which I became willing to look at other definitions of the divine. God still to this day has connotations for me that are too religious in nature. I don't feel like it's a big enough word to describe what I felt.
Right.
It's too small. And I'm not sure that I could say what I believe now exactly. It's hard to put into words, but it is it's a mystery to me, but it's not one that I feel like I need to solve.
Yeah, I feel the same way. I get that.
Oh, really?
Yeah, just like being in the experience is more than I could have ever imagined. And that's full enough. It's just constantly like, I don't want to put definition on it because then it stops there at the definition. And I just love the infiniteness of source energy or whatever we want to call it, like that it constantly expands and I learn more and I grow deeper and more connected. And like, I don't ever want to define that because I don't ever want it to stop evolving. But yeah, I get
Right.
that.
And I really realize that words are only pointers to direct us to what the experience is. They
Mhm.
can't define the experience. They do the best job they can, but some things are beyond words.
Yeah.
And this is one of those kinds of experiences. So I learned how to meditate. I was very interested in finding a path back to that state of euphoria, bliss, and looked at different formal religions, Buddhism, particularly with my meditation practice. I was looking at, different types, different styles of meditation. But ultimately, I'm put off by a lot of what organized religion involves. And the difference between spirituality and religion for me is that spirituality is much more personal, and religion is about an organization that has specific ideology, rules that define beliefs for everyone in the group. And after having myself defined in the Mormon Church in ways that were damaging, the last thing I was interested in was someone else defining my relationship with God.
Yeah, I get that. Yeah. So when you left, I know you were mentioning earlier, you were talking about the not being able to outrun the indoctrination. And I get that on a personal level because I feel like I've kind of been through a similar experience. I moved 6,000 miles away to Hawaii instead of dealing with it. But then 20 years later, I'm like, oh, wait, this is still completely ruling my life. Like, in the decisions that I make and the way I feel about myself and the way I feel about other people and, just so many things. So I just would love to hear what your experience of that.
Exactly. I did the same thing. I tried a geographic. I moved to New York City. That's about as far away physically and experientially as you can get from, Utah is white Wonder Bread, baby. And, the diversity melting pot of ideas and people and colors and was a huge shift. And I thought I could shed my skin like a snake and come out the other side with this move. And like your experience, I found that anything that I had not consciously brought up and dealt with was running my life. And I had experiences of just how long the deconstructing process is. It takes years, and it takes being in a variety of situations, I think, to see what's still active. It's like peeling an onion. You get through one layer and you think, okay, I'm done.
Yeah.
And then there's another layer.
Mm-hmm. A deeper layer.
A deeper layer.
Yeah.
Oh.
Yeah.
Did you find that your leaving created a schism in your family? Because that was a huge
I was going to
part of
ask you
my
about that.
experience.
It hadn't, because I'm not going to say I was hiding. I just kind of like left it all behind and was like, that's not me. I'm going to where I can be me. Came here, and have been on my own journey that I'm not going to get all the way into, but like, through different spiritual practices and like in the whole new age world and like everything until I've found myself where I am now. But, so it wasn't public. Like it was just me doing my own thing, 6,000 miles away. Nobody knew. I'm in a different time zone, different life, different friends, different people.
Right.
And it knows that I'm not in church, but just kind of like never bothered with it. Like, I felt like my whole life was consumed by the church for the first 20 years, that I didn't want to be the church girl or the anti-church girl. I just didn't want to be involved with the church. I just was living my own life, doing my own thing. But since I started this podcast and I've been writing this book and like being more public about my experience and my feelings, now I'm experiencing those things that I would have experienced 20 years ago.
Interesting.
Yeah. So, yeah, a lot of people that I used to feel seen by and close to, they just can't help themselves but send me religious stuff all the time online and trying to convert me and all of that, which is really dehumanizing. Yeah. I still haven't heard word from my mom about it. I'm assuming either she knows or she doesn't know, and she likes to look away from things that she doesn't like. So we're just going to leave it at that. But I've had some family members secretly kind of come behind the scenes and say, I'm proud of you and thank you for doing this. And this is so needed. And then the other ones are like, of course, I'm going to hell and I'm heretic and blah, blah, blah. You know what I mean? So I'm just trying to take from all this peace, joy, and happiness I'm experiencing over here. But yeah, I'm really starting to see this. So I'd really love to talk more, because I know you have a lot of experience with this and that you touch on this in your book about like setting boundaries with family and navigating these different relationships. So, people who are estranged from their families, like leaving the religion, what would you say to that?
When I left, I was the first one in my family to leave, but over time, other family members also left. And there was a real divide in my family, a polarization between the Mormons and the heretics. And we scattered when my parents divorced. My father ultimately, for a couple of different reasons, very significant reasons, also ended up pulling away from the church. He never left, but he stopped being active. And that was enough for my parents. It created a divide between my parents that they couldn't reconcile. And they divorced after 28 years of marriage. And it really put my family clearly into two camps. Those aligned as Mormons with my mother, and because my mother was all about doubling down then, more committed than ever to her faith. And the heretics, which were exploring lots of different possibilities to define spirituality or God. And it took a crisis in our family, and I'm not going to go into it here, but that crisis, it was a secret that we didn't know about. And when that came to light, luckily my family decided that family therapy might be helpful. Because we were geographically and emotionally at that point quite distant and hadn't seen each other in a couple of years, maybe 5 years. And after being a very, very tight clan, so everybody was kind of off doing their own thing. And we decided to gather once a year for a couple of days of family therapy and a reunion. And family therapy helped us understand that a lot of what our issues were semantic, that we were more alike than we were different when you really got through all of it. We loved our kids. We wanted to be good parents. We cared about the human race. We had values that were very similar. And that helped create an awareness that there was a possibility that we could dialogue more respectfully and more be more open about allowing everyone to have their own path. And that is not too typical.
No, it's not.
In a Mormon family.
You initiated this, and how did you get everyone on board?
Like I said, it was a crisis that shocked the family to its core. And that was enough to, I think, make people aware that we needed to do something, or we might as well just say, we're not a family anymore, and everybody go their own separate ways. I also think that the non-Mormons had all gotten some therapy of some sort, both to learn how to live with deconstructing their experience in the church, but also just personal issues. There was some alcohol and addiction issues, and those 12-step programs are incredibly helpful for raising your awareness and giving you some tools. But it was tough going. We even today don't discuss religion or politics. It's sort of just a tacit agreement across the board. We agree to disagree, but sometimes, assumptions are made. For example, when we're at a family gathering, the Mormons are the ones who bless the food because they're the religious.
Because they're talking to God, right?
They've got the direct line.
Oh, yeah.
And it's the subtle little things, and the Mormons don't understand why we might be offended that we're not included in, well, Dirk, would you, my brother, would you like to offer a blessing? That wouldn't do it for them. You know what I mean?
Oh, I do. Yes.
And so it's not easy. And I think we are very careful, and it still feels a little fragile at times. But most of us now at this point have had individual therapy, and that is, worth its weight in gold in terms of people understanding themselves well enough to understand and to put appropriate boundaries in place. I have to say that even though initially I got the treatment that you got, which was they were either afraid it was contagious, and so they avoided me, or they warned me that I had sold my soul to the devil and I was going to be in outer darkness forever. Or my mother chose to believe that eventually I would return, which she maintained for the next 30 years until she died.
Yeah, my mom is still there too.
Yeah. And so, but I realized that I had to honor each person's way of handling the situation and not judge it too much. Because we also realize that we don't control anybody else. And so my parents' attempts to control us and make us into fine, upstanding Mormon members had failed. And so, when you run out of options, you sometimes can turn to something more healthy, which is tolerance, acceptance, and love. And we really focus. I think our motto is we're more alike than we are different, and try to find the common ground.
Yeah.
So we had family reunions after that, where we finally dropped family therapy and just got together for 3 or 4 days at some location. We took turns running the family reunion, and the stories became more like Black humor. Remember when we did this and how awful that was, and we avoided things that would create tension or issues between us.
Yeah, you just gotta leave the elephant in the corner, huh?
Well, there's no way for it to be resolved.
Yeah.
I mean, the Mormons see their way as absolute truth. And I would say some of my brothers and sisters in their respective spiritual paths maybe feel more like that, even though I think the heretics tend to have a more inclusive idea of a spiritual path, that there are many paths up the mountain to God. Whereas the Mormons know that there is only one, theirs.
Yeah.
And that's there's no compromise in viewing it, from a different perspective.
Yeah. So I'm curious, because you come from this legacy. I deal with this a lot in my family because my grandparents were the pastors of our church, but they were also very good people. Like, they were just very loving, kind people who gave us a lot of values and things that were good. Now, there's also a shadow side to that, like there is to anything, that, a lot of enmeshment, a lot of unhealthy family bonds, a lot of guilt and shame and like obligation and those kinds of things, which, those who haven't deconstructed can't really quite see that. And so I deal with a lot of this, like, family legacy. Like, I'm ruining the family legacy. Like, it's their job to uphold the family legacy. Like, there's this enmeshment. They can't separate my grandparents as these two human people who had all sides from this legacy of the church. So I know you have that even deeper, going as far back in your history. How did that show up for you, and how did you navigate it?
Boy, I'm nodding my head here because I can completely relate. The sense, the mantra in my family was, "You're a Smith," i.e., make me proud, don't shame the family. There was a lot embodied in that statement. And it wasn't, they were also high achievers. My father came from a family where all of his brothers had been student body president. They were all Eagle Scouts. They all went on missions for the Mormon Church. There was an expectation to be better than, because you were special, you were singled out, you had been blessed by God. And so you were held to a higher standard, and in everything. And that perfectionism was a big part of my experience of dismantling how much came from family and how much came from the church, because we're instructed to be perfect as your Father in heaven is perfect, as Jesus is perfect.
Mm-hmm.
And yet, in therapy, I'm learning that it's okay not to be perfect, so you really see where they come into conflict. And it was hard, and it was also fairly public, which is one of the reasons I left Utah, was not to shame my family and my cousins and aunts and uncles with being a sinner.
Mm-hmm.
And the Mormon Church is so intimately integrated with community there. They don't refer to it as the Mormon Church or the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. It's the church.
Mm-hmm.
Nobody bothers to preface it because it is the norm. And so it wasn't until I left that I could even see it a little more objectively through the rearview mirror. But like I said, it caught up with me. All the indoctrination, and especially the role for women in Utah in the Mormon Church. You are honored for being a mother. That is, they call it even the Mother of Zion issue. There are really high rates of depression for Mormon women in Utah, one of the highest in the country. They have the highest rate of antidepressant use in the country, but their depression rates are extremely high. And I've written a blog, which you can find on my website, which is just lynnsmithgregory.com.
I'll link it in the show notes as well.
About why that is the case. And there is, it's such a patriarchal society. You don't see women in leadership positions. You don't see women in, and the only really available option, regardless of your desires or your inclination, is wife and mother. And that's really limiting. There's also a sort of toxic positivity about putting a happy face on everything. And one psychologist explained it as the, well, if I'm struggling and my neighbor across the street, who's also a Mormon, has 3 more kids than I do, and she seems to be doing great, what am I doing wrong? And so it's very hidden. The struggles are hidden. It's like there's something wrong with me, which is internalized. And one of the things that I realized was that it was never okay to express anger as a woman. You're supposed to be nice. You're supposed to be sweet, and you're not supposed to be ambitious, selfish, want things other than what the church wants for you, let alone to have a say in things. And even the temple ceremonies and stuff, I mean, men hold the priesthood in the Mormon Church, which is the power to act in God's name, not women.
Right.
And it's just in every single part of your life. And it happens at an age when you are so young. And I personally think we're held hostage to the view of the world that we're born into until we take it apart. and it's what we filter everything through.
Yes. Yes. And when that filter is at its core, you are born unworthy and sinful. That's
Wow.
what the word looks like. That's what the world looks like, no matter what you do. Of course you feel wrong, or like there's something wrong with me, or I'm unlovable, or whatever, because that's literally what we're taught is the basis of our creation. So
Right.
yeah.
You were created in sin and you have to be saved.
Mm-hmm. Yes.
Yeah. It's a
Sounds
little
like a real
different.
loving God, huh?
I know. It's like, who wants him? I know.
The petulant narcissist God.
Yeah, I remember thinking, when I was younger, that this idea of God, that there were certain things you could do that were unforgivable. And I thought, what could one of my kids do
Right.
that would be unforgivable? I couldn't imagine it. I thought, and it was a dangerous thought to have, that, well, if I'm capable of forgiving them, what's wrong with God? And that was quickly squashed. I don't know how questions were handled in your experience in a religious setting, but they were all, well, you don't need to know that now, and it will all be explained in the hereafter, and just put that on the shelf.
Right.
That.
Well, for me, it was more like the devil is talking to you. we need to pray so that those demons or whatever don't, possess you and overtake your mind and your soul, and that kind of thing.
Yeah, there was always a real sense of danger, that the devil was working overtime to sway you to his ways, and that you had to be eternally vigilant. It's one of the ways I think Mormons maintain their, I was going to say control, but their homogenous nature is churches is not a Sunday thing. It's an all week thing. I mean, every single day of the week, there is something going on at the church. Monday's family home evening, which is a church scripted lesson. Tuesday is the young men and women's, you go back to church for that. Wednesday is choir practice and blah, blah, blah. Thursday is primary, where the little kids get educated and stuff. And then there's priesthood meetings and Relief Society meetings. So it's really becomes a very insular bubble. And BYU is so desired so that you can go to a university setting and meet other Mormons at a time at which you're picking a future spouse.
Yeah, pretty much. Yeah, I grew up Pentecostal, so it's very similar. You go to the Bible college as a woman so that you can find your husband, you can find your preacher husband, which is the dream, right?
Right.
Or like my personal nightmare, but it's sold as a dream.
And did the cracks happen early for you, or were they sudden? Was it a sudden shift, or was it?
No, it was very gradual. I mean, I have a lot of intuitive gifts. Like I would have dreams that would come true the next day. I would see something in my mind and it would happen immediately after. I had spirits contacting me, but I didn't understand at the time. I thought they were demons because that was the only association I had for spirits outside of God and angels.
Yeah,
so that
makes
really
sense.
scared me a lot. So there was, I bought in. I did go in 100% for a very long time, but there was always this part of me that I knew existed and that I knew had a purpose, even though I had been convinced at that time that it was demonic or whatever. Like there was just this part of me that didn't believe it. And I feel like 90% of me was like, yes, all in or whatever. But there was that 10% just kind of hiding in the background, waiting for the opportunity. And once actually, to be completely candid, for me, it was cannabis.
Uh-huh.
I was so afraid to think of anything outside of what I'd been taught. I was so afraid that I would go to hell. I was so afraid I would disappoint God. I couldn't even allow myself to think those things. But when I would use cannabis, it would open up my mind, and all the things that I already knew, I couldn't deny them anymore. I couldn't deny them. And so it was a gradual of me getting all this understanding that I already had. And being like, okay, this isn't a mistake. This, what I'm hearing right now, what I'm experiencing right now, this is more real than anything I've heard in those four walls. And there was no denying it for me. So it was sort of gradual, but like I'm very much that way. Once the veil is lifted, once I see something, I can't unsee it. I can't pretend anymore. I can't go back. So,
it's like Pandora's box.
Working on, in therapy, I'm like still undoing the indoctrination part of it. But as far as the doctrine, I left that long time. It was just a natural transition. Yeah.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. Interesting. And it's interesting what's happening with psilocybin and mental health right now in terms of ways that we can get unlock our brain from its indoctrinated, hardwired almost ways of thinking to be more open to other ideas.
Yeah.
But I mean, I have been very surprised at how deep the indoctrination went. I mean, I've been out of the church for decades now, and I found myself several times surprised at situations that I didn't think would trigger me that triggered me.
Yeah, I get that. Like you said, it's an onion. It's just the layers. And you're like, oh, I thought I had dealt with that. Oh, well, here's a deeper layer. Yay. So do you still have family members that are leaving like the church, or is it just kind of done? Who's in is in and who's out is out? How does that look?
It's been only in the last couple of years that several people have left. So one was when my sister's son, who was a beloved member of her big family, she was a heavy duty Mormon, 9 kids, and one of her boys came out as gay. Well, the Mormon Church is quite homophobic. I mean, they say out of one side of their mouth that, we love everybody, but they can't hold the priesthood. They can't really basically participate in any way. And they have the church has participated in suggesting that kids go to conversion therapy and stuff. So it's pretty homophobic. And he is just the kindest, gentlest, most peace-loving soul and adored in that family. And that just was a river she couldn't cross. She was like, any church that thinks that he doesn't belong and isn't as valued a member of society or our religious organization, there's something wrong there.
Yeah.
And that was what triggered her decision to leave. And all of her kids followed suit except one.
Wow.
So, yeah, sometimes it takes something like that. Others had got one of my sister-in-laws got breast cancer, and had a spiritual experience, and she had been questioning the Mormon Church and had a spiritual experience. And for her, it confirmed that religion, that's just the words people use to describe what I'm experiencing.
Mhm. Yeah.
And it doesn't have the kind of formal boundaries that the Mormon Church had required.
It sounds like there's some like generational wounding and curses that are being broken in your family. I love that. Yeah, because there's not that death grip so much, like there's a lot of parents who would have stuck with the church, not their child, unfortunately. So
Yeah, it's true. I have a tremendous amount of respect because, and there's a huge population. Unfortunately, Utah has a very high rate of gay suicide,
yeah,
because there is a lot of rejection and lack of acceptance by devout Mormon members. They absolutely see it as a sin, and um, can't get past it.
yeah, yeah. What advice would you give to somebody who's leaving the church or who has a family member? Like, what ways do you support your family when this is happening, or what ways do you find that have been helpful for people who are deconstructing?
Right, right. It's a great question. I think giving yourself permission to take time to fully absorb and define how you feel before interacting with your family is a good
That's great
suggestion.
advice. That's really great advice.
I wouldn't go back to your family when you feel kind of half cocked.
Mm,
Go ahead and give yourself permission to take as much time as you need to fully decide exactly how you do feel and how you want to handle the situation in terms of choosing not to disclose it, whatever. I would suggest getting therapeutic support
mhm.
and a supportive community. Nowadays, you can go online, ex-Mormon. In fact, there's a term, Mormon blogosphere, because there are so many ex-Mormons online. Um, because often they're in isolated situations, rural towns or whatever, or they don't know who it's safe to be out loud about their doubts with. And so find a supportive community, preferably in person, but online. And also find some friends who have your back. So, because I underestimated the loss of family,
Mhm.
the sense of family. And I was fortunate that I had one or two really good friends who had my back at a time when I felt like it wasn't safe to go home, or talk to my family about what I was feeling. And I think having a lot of compassion and grace with your own deconstructing experience. I wish somebody had said, this is going to take time. This is not an easy thing to do.
Mhm.
I thought that once I understood that I'd been brainwashed, i.e., indoctrinated,
Mhm.
um, when I was in college, I took psychology classes and learned about brainwashing and groupthink and all that. And I thought, okay, I understand that. I'm done. And of course, that's just not the way it works. And understanding things intellectually and processing them emotionally are two different things.
Yeah. Yeah, I get that completely. Yeah, understanding it intellectually and then realizing, oh wait, it's still it's still hanging out. It's still hanging out over here. Um, What do you feel like? I know for me, like there was like a huge loss. We didn't say a loss of identity, but like why? Like with the church, you're given so much purpose. You have this, like, this is what you're doing. This is what you're here for. This is like whatever. And I know I have, found my own footing in that now. And I'm very clear about who I am and my enjoyment of the world, which is why I believe I'm here. But how did you reestablish your identity or build a new identity for yourself?
That's such a great question, because it was such a huge part of my identity. Being a Smith being related to Joseph Smith made me special. I was the envy of all my friends, in the church, because of the way they revere bloodline connections.
Mm-hmm.
And it was also it was being a Mormon and being a Smith Mormon was everything to me. And I didn't expect to feel the loss, especially as my family was imploding at the same time. I felt very adrift, unrooted. And it took quite a while before I was able to articulate. It really took until I had my spiritual experience myself that I felt safe enough. Luckily, I also married a man and our relationship was very much unlike my parents, which was very patriarchal in nature. And I saw my mother as completely powerless, and she was the martyr, and he was the severe patriarch. And he anchored me, and I also saw a different way of being through the kind of general acceptance that he gave me that wasn't based on perfection or performance, but kind of a love that was just because he loved me. I mean, and that was a whole new concept, that kind of love. And so when we had our own family, I was all about, doing it differently.
Yeah.
And of course, that's challenging.
Yeah, when it's wired into your brain.
When it's wired into your brain. Yeah.
It likes to show up. Yeah, there's some things that I realized that always I felt different or awkward or weird. And I realized now it was just these beliefs that were in me, that I was different, or like you said, special or whatever, and a lot of judgment and a lot of, just feeling on the outside of things. So I get that. To have real love, it shows you what the other isn't.
That's a great way to say it. When you have the real deal, you recognize that the other is fool's gold. It's pretend. It's
fool's gold. That's a great way to put it. Yeah. And I always say that about like figuring out who you are, rebuilding identity or whatever. For me, it's like, before you can do that, you have to figure out who you're not. And the church is
that's so true. Yeah, that's so true. And sometimes that is the beginning of defining ourselves is, well, I know that's not who I am.
Right.
Judgmental, critical, intolerant,
arrogant.
Convinced I'm the only person with the right answer.
Yeah. It's hard on relationships, isn't it? When you think you know everything.
Yeah. And it was weird coming to terms with the fact that there was something that was so safe about the certainty of Mormon answers. I didn't realize how safe that felt. Mormons had an answer for everything. I didn't have any answers for anything. So it was, just such a huge flip of the switch.
Yeah.
And, I missed that certainty. And I tried to fill it with being a certain atheist. These people, they just can't, accept the fact that it's a random universe and they need the idea of God because, so I was just as certain and arrogant and in my position as an atheist, than my brothers and sisters were with their, dogma. And it wasn't until I was broken open with the spiritual experience that I realized that it's all about connection, acceptance, forgiveness.
Yeah. I love that. How, in all of this journey and everything that you've been through up until this point, where would you say that you are now?
I would say that I'm no longer in active search mode. I think for quite a while, I was constantly reading the latest book on spirituality that came out. A sister and my father really got into A Course in Miracles, which is a spiritual belief, a path. And I looked at that and it didn't fit for me exactly. So I liked a lot of the concepts of it. But I didn't want to be defined down, but I felt I was pressed to continue to explore search mode. I was in the self-help section of the bookstore a lot.
Yeah.
And yeah. And whether it was conversation with God, whether it was untethering my soul or, whatever it was, I was looking for the answers and letting go of the idea that there is one answer was so free because now I can see, well, it looks like that's the answer for you. That's wonderful. Or I don't need to have the answer defined. I am now content with the mystery. I don't need to know how it all works.
Yes.
What is important to me is my experience of the divine, is my ability to connect not only with what I consider source or love, but it influences my life in a way that makes me, I feel, a better person. My mantra in the morning when I get up, I set my intention and basically say, let me be the face of kindness in every encounter today. It's so simple now. Whereas before, how does it all work? What happens after we die? Do we retain consciousness? Or are we a drop in the ocean? I wanted all the answers. And I don't know if it's just because I'm getting older that I'm more satisfied with not having them, but it doesn't trouble me.
Yeah. Yeah, I get that. Yeah, I feel like that need for the answers, that need for like something definite is a result of the indoctrination. Because like you said, we're given these set of rules, and if you follow these rules, then you're going to be okay. And so I feel like I know with me, like my brain is always grasping for a definite. And that's my newest thing that I've been working on within myself is just like, what do you feel? Like you get to decide what the answer is. You get to choose what the answer is. There is no definite what is right for you, what feels aligned for you. Which also shows me that like in the choices that I make, the attributes that I had given to the church about myself, the loving kindness and all of my spiritual connection and so many things that I had given credit to the church for. Now that I make decisions just based on what feels authentic to me, I realize that those things were just authentic to me. It didn't belong to the church. It's just a part of it.
Interesting that you were able to make that distinction and claim those for yourself.
It's only been recent, but yeah, it's been a blessing for sure.
That's wonderful. That's wonderful.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. So I like to end with what advice would you give with somebody who's thinking about deconstructing, with somebody who's just starting to have those thoughts about leaving? What would you give them?
I would say be compassionate with yourself. This is a painful sometimes process. It feels uncertain. It's going to take time, and reach out and for the resources and support that you need on your journey. And we all need those. There's no way to do this alone. And that's one of the gifts, is finding community, a different kind of community outside of the church community that you grew up in.
Yeah. Yeah, that's beautiful. I appreciate your time, Lynn. And for everybody listening, I will be posting all of the links and all the information on how to follow along her journey in the description of the show, as well as the blog post that follows a couple of weeks later. So thank you.
Thanks so much.
Thank you.
Melissa, it was a pleasure talking with you.
Thank you for joining me on this journey. If you enjoyed this episode, the best way to show your support is to subscribe wherever you listen to podcasts. Also, share your thoughts by leaving a 5-star review. It really helps more people to find this space. Want to go deeper? Head over to my website at leavingthechurchtofindgod.com. There, you can make a donation and make sure that we continue to have these conversations. No matter where you are on your spiritual journey, if you or someone you know would like to join the podcast and tell your story, please reach out to me on Instagram at authenticallymelly. Remember, you're not alone on this journey. Keep exploring, keep asking questions, and keep finding your own unique connection to something greater. Until next time, stay authentic, stay open, and aloha.